Philadelphia, October 1952. The telephone on Deputy District Attorney Leland Harker's nightstand rang at 4:30 in the morning, jolting him from uneasy sleep. His wife Constance stirred beside him but didn't wake. Leland reached for the receiver, his hand finding it on the second ring. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman he didn't recognize, strained, barely holding together. The woman's breath hitched. And Mrs. Dunmore's son down the hall, he's saying the same thing. About Captain Walt. They couldn't have planned it. We separated them, different apartments, but they're telling identical stories. Word for word. About the cellar. About secrets they promised to keep. About how they can't tell anyone because the captain earned his medal saving lives. Leland sat up, suddenly wide awake. He pulled his notebook from the drawer. Your address? 1709 Rittenhouse Street. The Grayson Apartments. We're on the 3rd floor. He wrote it down, promised he'd come by after breakfast, and hung up. But sleep was impossible now. Leland sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the darkened window, trying to understand why his chest felt so tight. Children had nightmares all the time. Overactive imaginations, stories that got out of hand. But two children from different families telling the same story, using the same words, describing the same details? That wasn't imagination. That was memory. He rose and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, Philadelphia was beginning to stir. Milk trucks rattled down the cobblestones. Streetlights still glowed against the pre-dawn gray. Newspaper boys would be out soon, hawking the morning edition. An ordinary October morning in an ordinary American city. But somewhere in that city, in one of those brick apartment buildings, lived a man who made children afraid to close their eyes. A man with a medal pinned to his chest. Leland filled a glass with water from the pitcher on his bureau and drank it down. 22 years as a prosecutor had taught him to distinguish truth from fabrication. Children couldn't lie identically. Each child had their own fears, their own vocabulary, their own way of seeing the world. But when two children from separate homes told the same story with the same words and the same details, that wasn't fantasy. That was testimony. Testimony about something that had actually happened. He returned to the bedroom and started dressing. Constance woke, glanced at the clock. "Lee, it's barely 5. You said you'd go after breakfast." He buttoned his shirt, reached for his tie. "Can't wait. There are children involved." Constance knew better than to argue when he used that tone. She simply rose and padded toward the kitchen. He didn't wait for breakfast. He drank his coffee standing, grabbed his briefcase, and left. The drive to Rittenhouse Street took 20 minutes through empty morning streets. Leland used the time to think. He'd prosecuted enough cases to know that accusations against respected community members rarely went well. People didn't want to believe that their neighbors, their friends, the pillars of their communities could be capable of terrible things. They'd rather believe the accusers were lying, mistaken, or malicious. And when the accused was a war hero, that made everything 10 times worse. But Leland had also learned that predators often hid in plain sight. They built reputations as good people specifically to create armor against suspicion. The beloved teacher, the dedicated coach, the friendly neighbor, the decorated veteran. These weren't accidents. They were carefully constructed facades. The Grayson Apartments, 1709 Rittenhouse Street. Walter Eugene Merriweather, Captain Walt to everyone in the building, had moved into apartment 3C in November 1945, fresh off the boat from Europe. The Veterans Administration had helped him secure the lease. 2 rooms with a kitchenette, $15 a month. He'd arrived with a duffel bag, discharge papers, and a bronze star for valor. The medal sat in a small frame on his mantelpiece, polished weekly. Everyone in the building knew about it. Everyone respected it. Merriweather had been born in 1918 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the youngest of 3 brothers. His father had worked in the coal mines. His mother had taken in laundry. They'd been poor but respectable. Walter had been a quiet child, good in school, never caused trouble. He'd enlisted in the Army in 1940, before Pearl Harbor, looking for a way out of the mines. He'd served with the 28th Infantry Division, the Keystone Division, Pennsylvania's own. The division had seen some of the worst fighting of the war: Normandy, the Hurtgen Forest, the Battle of the Bulge. Walter had started as a private and worked his way up to corporal. He'd been good at his job, organized, reliable, calm under fire. The Bronze Star citation mentioned organizing the evacuation of 17 wounded men from a position under German artillery fire near the Belgian border in December 1944. According to witnesses, Corporal Merriweather had maintained order when others panicked, directed the wounded to safety, and stayed behind to ensure everyone got out. He'd taken shrapnel in his left leg during the evacuation, but had refused treatment until all the wounded were accounted for. It was genuine heroism. No one disputed that. The men he'd saved wrote letters home about him. His commanding officer recommended him for the medal personally. When Walter came home in late 1945, he came home a legitimate war hero. He'd found work at a machine shop in Kensington, operating a lathe 5 days a week. The work was steady, the pay decent. He kept to himself mostly, except for the Veterans of Foreign Wars Lodge on Thursday nights and church on Sundays at St. Adalbert's. No wife, no family. His 2 brothers had both been killed in the war, one at Guadalcanal, one in North Africa. His parents had died while he was overseas, his mother of cancer, his father in a mining accident. Walter Merriweather was alone in the world. His neighbors considered him a model tenant. Mrs. Carlotta Fenimore, who lived across the hall, would later recall, "Walt was the perfect neighbor. Quiet as a mouse, never any trouble. He'd help carry groceries up the stairs for the older ladies, shovel the front walk in winter, fixed my radiator once when the super was nowhere to be found. And he loved children. Always had a kind word for the little ones. I used to think it was such a shame he never married, never had kids of his own. He would have made a wonderful father." The building had filled with young families after the war. The GI Bill and steady factory work meant people could afford rent and raise children. By 1950, the courtyard behind the Grayson Apartments hummed with the sound of kids playing stickball, jumping rope, playing hopscotch on the cracked pavement. Young mothers hung laundry on lines strung between buildings. Fathers tinkered with cars in the alley. It was a vibrant, tight-knit community. Walter Merriweather started spending time in the courtyard in the late spring of 1948. At first, he just sat on the bench near the building entrance, reading the Philadelphia Inquirer, feeding pigeons from a paper bag of breadcrumbs. Then he started talking to the children. He told war stories, sanitized versions, nothing too gruesome. Stories about his buddies, about the march across France, about receiving his Bronze Star from a general whose name the children didn't recognize, but who sounded important. The children listened with rapt attention. For them, Captain Walt was a living connection to the war they'd heard about on the radio, the war their fathers and uncles had fought. He never raised his voice, never used harsh language. He was patient with their questions, generous with his time. By 1949, he was helping fix bicycles, teaching boys how to throw a proper fastball, making kites out of newspaper and twine. He organized games of capture the flag in the courtyard. He refereed disputes over whose turn it was on the swing set. The perfect honorary uncle. The parents approved wholeheartedly. This was 1950s Philadelphia. Neighborhoods were tight-knit. Everyone looked out for everyone else's kids. If Captain Walt was sitting on his bench, that meant the children were supervised. Mothers could cook dinner or hang laundry without worry. Fathers working late shifts knew their kids weren't running wild. A war hero watching the kids? What could be safer? By October 1952, Walter Merriweather was 34 years old. He'd taken early retirement from the machine shop earlier that year on a disability pension. His war injury, the shrapnel in his leg, had never healed properly, caused chronic pain and limited mobility. The disability check wasn't much, but combined with his veterans' benefits, it was enough to live on. And it meant he had more time. More time in the courtyard, more time with the children. He organized weekend trips to the Franklin Institute, the Science Museum downtown. He took groups of boys to Saturday matinees at the Boyd Theater, bought them popcorn and soda. He helped with homework, particularly math and history. Parents praised him constantly. Mrs. Fenimore baked him apple pies every Thanksgiving. The building super gave him a discount on rent in exchange for keeping an eye on things during the day. No one noticed that Captain Walt had favorites, that he didn't treat all children the same, that certain boys, quiet ones, from single-parent homes, the ones who seemed lonely or troubled, received special attention. Extra invitations, more personal conversations, requests for small favors. Could you help me carry this package down to the cellar? I need someone to hold the flashlight while I check the furnace. Would you mind helping me organize some boxes in storage? Simple requests, helpful errands, nothing that raised alarm bells. After all, Captain Walt lived alone, had limited mobility from his war wound. Of course he needed help sometimes. And the boys he asked were the ones who seemed to need positive male attention. Their fathers were dead or absent. Captain Walt was filling a gap, being a mentor, a role model. Everyone thought it was wonderful. Until 9-year-old Wesley Dunmore refused to go down to the cellar anymore. The breaking point. Pauline Dunmore worked as a switchboard operator at the Bell Telephone Exchange on Market Street. It was exacting work. Plugging cables, connecting calls, maintaining polite efficiency for 8 hours straight. But it paid better than factory work and had better hours. She worked the day shift, 7 to 3, which meant she could be home when Wesley got out of school. Pauline's husband Frank had died at Anzio in January 1944, one of thousands of American casualties in that brutal Italian campaign. Wesley had been not quite a year old. He had no memory of his father, knew him only from photographs and the stories Pauline told. Frank in his uniform, grinning at the camera. Frank holding baby Wesley, looking terrified and proud. Frank's last letter, written 2 days before he died, talking about coming home, about teaching his son to play baseball. Pauline had raised Wesley alone for 8 years. Her parents were dead. Frank's parents were back in West Virginia and too elderly to help. She had no siblings. It was just her and Wesley against the world. She was practical, skeptical, and fiercely protective. She'd had to be. Single mothers in 1952 Philadelphia weren't exactly celebrated. She'd faced judgment, condescension, unwanted advances from men who thought a widow must be desperate. But she'd persevered. She kept a clean home, raised a polite son, paid her bills on time. She attended PTA meetings, volunteered for school fundraisers, went to church. She did everything right. When Wesley came home one Wednesday afternoon in October and said he wasn't going to help Captain Walt anymore, something in his voice made Pauline stop stirring the pot roast and sit down at the kitchen table.
Why not, honey?
Wesley wouldn't look at her. His hands twisted together in his lap. He was small for his age, with Frank's dark hair and Pauline's gray eyes. A quiet boy, good in school, didn't cause trouble. I just don't want to. Did something happen? Silence. Then tears. Then, in a small voice that broke Pauline's heart, ___quote _13___. Pauline felt ice crystallize in her stomach. She knelt in front of her son, took his hands. __quote _14___. And Wesley told her. Captain Walt had been taking him down to the cellar storage area for months, since spring, maybe April or May. At first, it was just to help move boxes or check the coal furnace or hold the flashlight while Walt looked for something. Wesley had been proud to help. Captain Walt was a war hero. Having him ask for help felt special. Then Walt started showing him things. A German helmet he claimed to have taken from an SS officer he'd killed in hand-to-hand combat. A Luger pistol unloaded that Walt let Wesley hold. Dog tags from fallen buddies. A tattered Nazi flag. Things that made Wesley feel trusted, initiated into secrets. Walt would tell stories about each item. The helmet. He'd killed that German in a bombed-out farmhouse in France, just the two of them, hand to hand. And when it was over, Walt had taken the helmet as a trophy. The Luger, pulled off a dead officer in the Ardennes. The dog tags, buddies who died right next to him, whose names he'd never forget. Wesley had listened, mesmerized. This was real history, real heroism, happening right in front of him. Then the visits changed. Walt started talking about how soldiers had to be tough, how they couldn't be soft or weak, how the Army tested men to make sure they were strong enough for combat. He said he wanted to make sure Wesley could grow up to be strong like his father, like the men who died at Anzio. He started asking Wesley to do exercises, push-ups, sit-ups, jumping jacks. Normal enough. Then he'd critique Wesley's form, adjust his posture, place hands on Wesley's body to demonstrate proper technique. The touches felt wrong, lingered too long, moved to places that made Wesley uncomfortable. Walt explained it was normal, that drill sergeants did this, that it was how you taught discipline and strength, that if Wesley wanted to honor his father's memory, he needed to toughen up. Then came the medical inspections. Walt said that on the front lines, soldiers had to be examined regularly to make sure they were fit for duty, that real men weren't ashamed of their bodies, that Wesley needed to overcome his embarrassment if he wanted to become a soldier someday. He locked the cellar door, drew the curtain across the small window, told Wesley this was confidential, just between them, the way it would be with an Army doctor. Wesley, 9 years old, desperately wanting to make his dead father proud, wanting to become strong and brave, trusting Captain Walt because everyone said Captain Walt was a hero. Wesley complied. The inspections happened once a week, sometimes twice. Each time, Walt's behavior became more inappropriate, more invasive, more clearly wrong. But he always explained it as normal, as necessary, as what soldiers endured. And he always reminded Wesley, "Don't tell anyone. They won't understand. They'll think you're making it up. I'm a hero, Wesley. I have a bronze star. Everyone trusts me. If you accuse me of anything wrong, who do you think they'll believe?" Last week, Walt had crossed a line that even Wesley, confused and manipulated as he was, recognized as absolutely wrong. Wesley couldn't articulate exactly what had happened. He didn't have the vocabulary, didn't fully understand, but he knew it was bad. He'd felt violated, frightened, ashamed. He'd pulled away, grabbed his clothes, run upstairs. He hadn't slept since. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Walt reaching for him in the dim cellar light. Pauline held her son while he cried, fighting to keep her own voice steady, fighting not to scream or weep or run downstairs and kill Walter Merriweather with her bare hands. __quote _15_____. When Wesley finally cried himself out, Pauline tucked him into bed, kissed his forehead, and went to see her friend Iris Carmody. Iris lived 2 floors down in apartment 1D. She was a nurse at Pennsylvania Hospital, worked night shifts, raised her 10-year-old son Marcus alone. Her husband had been killed at Iwo Jima. She and Pauline had bonded over shared widowhood, helped each other with childcare and groceries, and the million small struggles of single motherhood in post-war Philadelphia. Pauline knocked on Iris's door. When Iris answered, Pauline said without preamble, "Does Marcus spend time with Walt Merriweather?" Iris's smile faded. Quote 17, quote 18. Iris's face changed. The color drained from her cheeks. "Pauline, what are you saying? Just ask him, please, right now." They sat Marcus down at the kitchen table. Iris used the voice she reserved for serious matters, gentle but unyielding, the voice that meant she needed the absolute truth. "Marcus, I need you to tell me about Captain Walt. Has he ever taken you down to the cellar?" Marcus went very still. His eyes darted between his mother and Pauline. "Sometimes, to help with stuff." "What kind of stuff?" "Just moving boxes, checking the furnace." Anything else? Marcus looked down at his hands. He shows me war stuff, German things. What else happens down there? Nothing. Marcus? Iris's voice was still gentle, but carried the weight of maternal authority. Marcus started crying, and then he told her. The same story Wesley had told. The German helmet, the secret war trophies, the exercises to build strength, the medical inspections, the inappropriate touching, the constant reminders that Captain Walt was a hero, that everyone trusted him, that if Marcus told anyone, they'd think he was lying or crazy. The progression had been the same. The manipulation had been identical. Even some of the phrases Walt used were word for word what he'd said to Wesley. Iris Carmody listened to her son, and something inside her transformed from shock to cold, focused rage. When Marcus finished, she hugged him, told him he was brave, told him he'd done nothing wrong. Then she looked at Pauline. We're going to the police, right now. Pauline nodded. I'll watch the boys. You go. Iris Carmody didn't remember the walk to the 18th Precinct station house. One moment she was in her apartment. The next she was pounding on the desk sergeant's counter, demanding to speak to whoever investigated crimes against children. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man named O'Malley, who'd seen everything in 20 years on the force, tried to calm her down. Ma'am, I need you to... There's a man in my building who's been hurting children. Multiple children. My son and my friend's son and God knows how many others. His name is Walter Merriweather. He lives at the Grayson Apartments on Rittenhouse Street, and someone needs to arrest him right now. O'Malley's expression shifted. That's a serious accusation, ma'am. I need you to fill out a formal complaint, and I'll fill out whatever you need. But I'm telling you right now, this man is dangerous. He's been doing this for years. He's using his status as a war veteran to manipulate children and intimidate them into silence. And if you don't do something about it immediately, I'm going to the newspapers. O'Malley picked up the phone. The investigation begins. The case landed on Leland Harker's desk at 9 o'clock that morning. He'd been in his office since 7, working through a backlog of assault cases, when his secretary knocked and said the police had sent over an urgent referral. Leland read through the initial complaint twice. 2 children, 2 families, nearly identical accounts. Allegations of ongoing manipulation and boundary violations by a decorated war veteran. His gut told him this was real. His experience told him it would be nearly impossible to prosecute. He was 46 years old, had been with the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office for 22 years. He'd started as an assistant prosecutor fresh out of Temple Law School in 1930, worked his way up through misdemeanors and felonies, earned his current position as deputy DA in 1948. He'd prosecuted hundreds of cases, murders, rapes, robberies, frauds. He'd seen the worst of human nature. But something about this case made him feel sick in a way he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was because he had 2 children of his own, Margaret, 16, and Thomas, 13. Good kids, doing well in school, giving him and Constance no trouble. He tried to imagine someone doing to Thomas what had allegedly been done to Wesley Dunmore and Marcus Carmody. The thought made him want to commit violence. Or maybe it was because he'd served in the war himself. Not in combat, he'd been too old for frontline service, had spent 3 years as a communications officer stateside, coordinating logistics. But he knew plenty of men who'd seen combat. Good men, brave men, who'd come home damaged by what they'd experienced. And he knew that trauma didn't excuse everything, that heroism in war didn't automatically translate to virtue in peace. He picked up the phone, called the 18th Precinct, asked for the detective who'd taken the initial report. Detective Eugene Holloway arrived at Leland's office an hour later. He was in his 50s, gray-haired, with the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much. He dropped a folder on Leland's desk. 2 mothers, 2 boys, same story. I interviewed them separately. The boys don't know what the other said. But they're telling identical stories about this Merriweather character. Same progression, same tactics, same threats about not being believed. You think it's credible? I think kids don't lie in identical detail like this. One kid making something up, maybe. But two kids from different families who we separated before interviewing, telling the same story with the same specifics? That's not fabrication. That's memory. Leland nodded. What do we know about Merriweather? 34 years old, lives alone, disability pension from a war injury. Bronze Star recipient. The citation's legitimate, I checked. Organized an evacuation under fire in Belgium, winter of '44. Saved 17 men. No criminal record, not even a traffic ticket. Building super says he's a model tenant. Neighbors love him. Everyone describes him as helpful, quiet, good with kids. Of course they do, Leland muttered. Nobody suspects the helpful neighbor. There's something else. I did some asking around, talked to other mothers in the building. Turns out Merriweather's been taking boys to his cellar for at least 3 years, maybe longer. Calls them his helpers. Always boys, always from single-mother households, always between ages 8 and 12. Leland felt his stomach tighten. How many? I've got names of 7 boys so far. Most of the mothers didn't think anything of it, figured he was being nice, giving the boys some male attention. But a couple mothers mentioned their son seemed scared of him, or didn't want to go help him anymore, or had nightmares. The mothers didn't connect it to Merriweather, just figured the kids were going through something. We need to interview all of them. Already started. Got 3 appointments set up for this afternoon. But Harker, Holloway leaned forward. This is going to get ugly. Merriweather's got a Bronze Star. He's a war hero. The VFW post he belongs to has 300 members. We go after him, we're going after every veteran in this city by proxy. They're going to close ranks, claim we're dishonoring heroes, probably organize protests. Let them protest. If he did what these kids say he did, I don't care how many medals he has. Holloway smiled grimly. That's why I brought this to you. I figured you'd say that. Building the case. Over the next week, Leland and Holloway interviewed everyone in the Grayson apartments. Most residents defended Merriweather passionately. He was a good man, a patriot, someone who'd sacrificed for his country. The accusations were offensive, impossible, probably the result of children misunderstanding innocent interactions or making up stories for attention. Mrs. Fenimore, Merriweather's neighbor, was particularly vehement. Walter would never hurt a child, never. I've known him for 7 years. He's the kindest man I've ever met. Those boys are lying, or their mothers put them up to it. Maybe they want money, or attention, or who knows what. But I'll tell you right now, Walter Merriweather is a hero, and this is how we treat heroes in America. It's disgraceful. The building superintendent, a man named Kowalski, agreed. Captain Walt's done more for this building than anyone. Fixes things, keeps an eye out, helps people. He's got a gimpy leg from the war, but he never complains. And he's great with kids, always playing with them, teaching them, making sure they stay out of trouble. Whatever these boys are saying, they've got it wrong. Kids get confused. They don't understand things. Walt's innocent, and anyone who knows him knows that. But a few parents hesitated. When pressed privately, when Holloway and Leland promised confidentiality, some admitted their children had mentioned uncomfortable interactions with Captain Walt. 11-year-old Calvin Pritchard, whose father had died in a factory accident in 1950. Calvin had started avoiding the courtyard, making excuses not to go outside when Captain Walt was there. His mother had noticed but hadn't thought much of it. Figured Calvin was going through a phase, being moody like kids that age sometimes were. When they sat Calvin down and asked him gently about Captain Walt, the boy broke down. Same story. The cellar, the war trophies, the exercises, the inspections, the threats. Calvin had been too ashamed to tell anyone, convinced no one would believe him over a war hero. 12-year-old Ned Stillwater, whose mother worked double shifts at a textile factory. Ned had started having nightmares in the summer, waking up screaming. His mother had taken him to a doctor who'd prescribed warm milk before bed and said Ned was probably anxious about starting junior high. The nightmares had continued. Ned told them about Captain Walt, about trips to the cellar that started in early 1951, about 2 years of manipulation, of boundary violations, of being made to feel complicit in his own victimization, about the crushing weight of the secret he'd been carrying. 8-year-old Donnie Oakes, whose father had abandoned the family in 1949. Donnie was shy, small, easy to overlook. Captain Walt had started paying attention to him in the spring of 1952. The trips to the cellar had only been happening for a few months, but the pattern was the same. By the end of the week, Leland had 7 separate witness statements. 7 boys, ages 8 to 12, all from fatherless homes, all describing similar experiences with Walter Merriweather. The accounts varied in detail. Each boy remembered different conversations, different items Walt had shown them, different specific incidents. But the overall pattern was identical. The evidence was compelling. But it was also entirely testimonial. No physical proof, no photographs, no witnesses, no medical evidence. Just the word of children against the word of a decorated war veteran. Leland knew this would be a difficult case to win. Defense attorneys would attack the children's credibility, point out inconsistencies in their memories, suggest they'd been coached or had concocted a shared fantasy. And the jury, almost certainly made up of people who revered veterans, who wanted to believe in heroes, would be predisposed to doubt the children. But Leland also knew that if he didn't pursue this case, Merriweather would continue victimizing children. The pattern was too clear, too calculated. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a series of innocent interactions misinterpreted by confused children. This was deliberate predation. He took the file to District Attorney Raymond Whitlock. Political calculations. Raymond Whitlock's office occupied the corner of the 5th floor of City Hall, with windows overlooking Market Street. Whitlock was 52, silver-haired, with the smooth confidence of a man who'd never lost an election. He'd been DA since 1946, won re-election in 1950 with 70% of the vote, and was already positioning himself for a run at mayor in 1955. He read through Leland's case file in silence, his face carefully neutral. When he finished, he closed the folder and looked up. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 55, underscore, 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 underscore. Leland had expected this. Quote, 56, quote, 57. Whitlock leaned back in his chair. Quote, 58, quote, 59, quote, 60, quote, 61, quote, 62. Whitlock pulled out a cigarette, lit it, blew smoke toward the ceiling. Quote, 63, quote, 64, quote, 65, quote, 66, quote, 67. Whitlock took another drag. Quote, 68, quote, 69. Whitlock studied Leland for a long moment. Whitlock sighed. He stubbed out his cigarette. The arrest. Leland got his warrant on October 28, 1952. He'd spent 2 weeks building the case, interviewing witnesses, documenting every detail. Detective Holloway had been thorough, professional, unshakable in his conviction that the children were telling the truth. On a gray Wednesday morning, Leland and 2 uniformed officers went to the Grayson apartments. Word had spread through the building about the investigation. Some residents had heard rumors that Captain Walt was being accused of something terrible. Most didn't believe it. A few were starting to wonder. Mrs. Fenimore tried to block the stairs. Leland kept his voice level. One of the officers gently moved her aside. She screamed at them, called them traitors, said they'd regret this. Other tenants emerged from their apartments, drawn by the commotion. Some shouted support for Mrs. Fenimore. Others stayed silent, watching with troubled expressions. Leland climbed to the 3rd floor, knocked on apartment 3C. Walter Merriweather answered the door in his bathrobe and slippers. He was unshaven, looked like he'd just woken up. When he saw Leland and the officers, his expression went carefully blank. Leland held up the warrant. Merriweather's face remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or calculation. I understand, but I think you're making a terrible mistake. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. For a moment, Leland thought Merriweather might resist. Then Merriweather's shoulders slumped slightly. He turned, placed his hands behind him. The officer cuffed him. As they led him downstairs, neighbors lined the hallways. Some wept. Some shouted at Leland. One man, a veteran himself, judging by the VFW pin on his jacket, stepped forward, chest out, blocking their path. Leland met the man's eyes. "Step aside, sir." "Go to hell." The officer moved the man out of the way. They continued down the stairs, through the growing crowd, to the police car waiting at the curb. As Leland opened the car door, someone threw an egg that splattered across his shoulder. Someone else threw a tomato that hit the car window. The crowd was getting ugly. They drove away quickly. In the back seat, Merriweather sat silently, staring straight ahead. Leland watched him in the rearview mirror, trying to read his expression. But Merriweather's face was a mask. At the station, they processed Merriweather, took his fingerprints, photographed him. He remained calm throughout, answering questions in a flat, emotionless voice. When they asked if he wanted to make a statement, he said, quote, 86, quote, 87. Merriweather called Horace Pendergast, one of the best defense attorneys in Philadelphia. Pendergast arrived within the hour, expensive suit and confident smile. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 88, underscore, underscore, Pendergast told his client. Then he turned to Leland. Leland said, Pendergast smiled. Leland said nothing. He'd made his choice. Now he had to see it through. Pre-trial. The story hit the Philadelphia Inquirer the next day. War hero arrested on shocking charges. The article was sympathetic to Merriweather, noting his decorated service, his quiet life, his good reputation. It mentioned the charges only vaguely, allegations of improper conduct with minors, but implied they were likely false or exaggerated. The veterans groups mobilized immediately. The VFW post Merriweather belonged to organized a rally outside City Hall. 200 veterans showed up, some in uniform, carrying signs, "Heroes deserve respect," and "Children lie, veterans don't." The American Legion issued a statement condemning the district attorney's office for pursuing charges against a decorated veteran without physical evidence. The Gold Star mothers, women who'd lost sons in the war, held a press conference supporting Merriweather, saying that men who'd sacrificed for their country deserved the benefit of the doubt. Leland's office received dozens of angry phone calls daily. Letters poured in, most calling him a disgrace, a traitor, an opportunist using a good man to advance his career. Someone slashed the tires on his car. Someone else threw a brick through his office window. Constance worried about their safety. "Maybe you should ask to be taken off the case. Let someone else handle it." "I can't do that," Leland said. "Those boys are counting on me." "What about our boys? What about Thomas and Margaret? What if someone comes after them to get to you?" "No one's going to hurt our children." "You don't know that. Lee, this is tearing the city apart. Is it really worth it?" Leland looked at his wife. "Yes, it is. Because if we don't hold people accountable for hurting children, even respected people, even heroes, then what kind of society are we?" Constance sighed. She knew when her husband's mind was made up. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 102, underscore, underscore. The preliminary hearing was held in November. Pendergast moved to dismiss the charges, arguing insufficient evidence. Judge Harriman, a veteran himself, Purple Heart from the First World War, listened to both sides and denied the motion. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 103, underscore, underscore. Pendergast had argued that the children's testimony was unreliable, that they'd been coached, that their stories were suspiciously similar. Leland countered that similarity in testimony indicated truthfulness, not fabrication. Judge Harriman set the trial date for February 1953. The first trial. The trial began on a cold Monday in February. The courtroom was packed. Veterans filled the gallery, some in full uniform. Journalists crowded the press section. Curious citizens lined up outside, hoping to get a seat. Horace Pendergast's opening statement was masterful. He painted Merriweather as a humble hero, a man who'd risked everything for his country, who'd come home asking for nothing, who'd quietly tried to give back to his community by mentoring fatherless boys. He described the Bronze Star citation in detail, the 17 men saved, the shrapnel wound Merriweather still carried. Pendergast said, his voice dripping with indignation, Leland's opening was simpler. 7 children, 7 separate families, 7 accounts that match in every significant detail. These children don't know each other well. They weren't friends. They certainly didn't conspire to invent identical stories, but they're telling the same truth, that Walter Merriweather exploited his status as a war hero to gain their trust, then violated that trust in the worst possible way. The defense will try to convince you that these children are lying, but I ask you to listen carefully to their testimony. Listen to the details. Listen to the consistency. And ask yourself, could 7 children from different families fabricate identical stories about a man they all trusted? Or are they simply telling the truth about what happened to them? Then came the witnesses. Wesley Dunmore took the stand first. Leland had prepared him carefully, told him to speak slowly, to answer only what was asked, to tell the truth without embellishment. Wesley did well. He described meeting Captain Walt, the trips to the cellar, the war souvenirs, the way the visits gradually changed. He talked about feeling confused and scared, but not knowing how to say no to an adult, especially a war hero everyone respected. Then Pendergast cross-examined him. Wesley, you like movies, don't you? Yes, sir. What kind of movies? Cowboy movies. Adventure movies. Do you ever pretend to be characters from those movies? Sometimes. Do you ever make up stories based on things you've seen in movies? I guess so. So you have an active imagination. I don't know. Let me ask you this. Have you ever lied to your mother to avoid getting in trouble? Wesley hesitated. The trap was obvious, but he was 9 years old and scared. Maybe once or twice. So you admit you've lied before? That was different. Just answer yes or no. Have you lied before? Yes. No further questions. Leland tried to rehabilitate on redirect. Wesley, when you lied to your mother, what were you lying about? One time I said I did my homework when I didn't. Was that lie about something that happened to you, or about something you didn't want to do? Something I didn't want to do. Are you lying now about what Captain Walt did to you in the cellar? No, I'm telling the truth. But Pendergast had planted the seed of doubt. One by one, the children testified. Marcus Carmody, Calvin Pritchard, Ned Stillwater, Donnie Oakes, and 2 others. Each told their story. Each held up reasonably well under direct examination. But Pendergast was relentless in cross-examination, finding tiny inconsistencies, suggesting ulterior motives, painting them as unreliable witnesses who might be mistaken or lying. Then, Walter Merriweather took the stand. He wore his dress uniform, the Bronze Star prominent on his chest. He looked dignified, composed, almost serene. Pendergast walked him through his war service in detail. The beaches of Normandy, the brutal winter of the Bulge, the moment he organized the evacuation that earned him the medal. Tell the jury what happened that day in Belgium, Pendergast said. Merriweather's voice was steady, matter of fact. The jury was riveted. Several had tears in their eyes. Then Pendergast asked about the allegations. Quote, 134, quote, 135, quote, 136, quote, 137. It was a powerful performance. Merriweather came across as dignified, sincere, wounded by the accusations. Leland cross-examined. Quote, 138. Quote, 139. Quote, 140. Quote, 141. Quote, 142. Merriweather hesitated. 40-45. Leland pushed, but Merriweather remained calm, consistent, unshakable. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They sent out a note saying they were deadlocked. Judge Harriman sent them back to deliberate further. 2 hours later, they returned, still deadlocked. 9 for conviction, 3 for acquittal. Judge Harriman had no choice. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 152, underscore, underscore. Pendergast shook Merriweather's hand, smiling. That's as good as a win. They won't retry this. But Pendergast was wrong. The Journal Merriweather was released on bail. He returned to the Grayson apartments, though the atmosphere had changed. About half the residents still supported him, believed he was innocent. The other half weren't sure anymore. The trial testimony had been disturbing. 7 children telling similar stories was hard to dismiss. Parents kept their children away from Merriweather now, just to be safe. The courtyard, once full of kids, emptied whenever he appeared. He sat alone on his bench, feeding pigeons, ignored by everyone. He started spending more time in his apartment. Started writing. Merriweather had kept a journal since boot camp in 1940. During the war, he documented his experiences, battles, casualties, moments of fear and courage. After the war, he'd continued the habit, writing about his daily life, his thoughts, his plans. Now, angry and isolated, he wrote about the trial, about the children who'd testified against him, about the prosecution's tactics, about his strategies for rebuilding his reputation. And he made a mistake. He wrote about the boys, about how he'd selected them, identifying lonely, vulnerable children from fatherless homes, about how he'd built their trust gradually, about the techniques he'd used to manipulate them into compliance and silence. He wrote as if he were documenting a military campaign, using tactical language. Identified target, established rapport, advanced operational objectives, maintained operational security through psychological control. He wrote about using his Bronze Star as a tool, knowing that people would automatically trust a war hero, that children especially would be awed by his status. He wrote about explaining to the boys that soldiers underwent harsh training, that weakness had to be overcome, that what happened in the cellar was preparation for manhood. He wrote everything down, perhaps out of arrogance, perhaps out of some twisted need to preserve his accomplishments. And he kept the journal in his apartment, hidden in the back of his closet behind a loose board, but not destroyed. In January 1953, a veteran named Raymond Kozak visited Merriweather. Kozak had served in the Pacific, had been at Guadalcanal and Okinawa, had killed Japanese soldiers in hand-to-hand combat. He was a hard man, shaped by brutal warfare. But he was also a father. He had 3 sons. He'd heard about the trial. He'd initially supported Merriweather, a fellow veteran being persecuted by opportunistic prosecutors. But something about the testimony had bothered him. 7 boys. 7 identical stories. The more Kozak thought about it, the less sense the false accusation narrative made. So he visited Merriweather to judge for himself. They talked for an hour. Merriweather maintained his innocence, said the boys were confused or lying, said he was the victim of a witch hunt. But something was off. Kozak had interrogated prisoners during the war, had learned to read people. Merriweather's words said one thing, but his body language said another. There were micro-expressions, small tells that suggested Merriweather was lying. Kozak left disturbed. A few days later, he contacted Leland Harker. Kozak said. Leland said. Kozak was quiet for a moment. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 166, underscore, underscore, Leland knew what Kozak was suggesting. That if Merriweather had evidence of his crimes, he might not have destroyed it. That arrogance or stupidity might have led him to keep documentation, Leland said. Leland understood. Kozak was offering to create a pretext, to manufacture a reason for a search. But Leland couldn't cross that line. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but it has to be legitimate. Otherwise, any evidence we find gets thrown out. Kozak sighed. All right, I understand. But Harker, that man is guilty, and he's going to get away with it unless you find proof. 3 weeks later, Merriweather reported a break-in. He called the police, said someone had entered his apartment and taken some personal items. The responding officers found the door unlocked, no signs of forced entry. Nothing obviously missing. They suspected Merriweather was lying, maybe trying to garner sympathy or set up an insurance claim. But they were obligated to investigate. They walked through the apartment, documented the scene, asked Merriweather what was missing. Some letters, he said, personal correspondence, and maybe some other things. I'm not sure yet. The officers were skeptical, but one of them, Officer Garrett, knew about the trial, knew that Leland had suspected there might be evidence in the apartment. Garrett called Detective Holloway. You might want to come down here. Merriweather's reporting a burglary, but something feels off. Holloway arrived, looked around the apartment, noticed that Merriweather seemed nervous, kept glancing at the closet. Holloway had a hunch. Mr. Merriweather, were any items taken from your closet? No, I don't think so. Mind if I look? Actually, I do mind, unless you have a warrant. That confirmed Holloway's suspicion. He got a warrant, legitimate this time, based on the burglary report and Merriweather's suspicious behavior. They searched the apartment thoroughly, found the loose board in the closet, found the journal hidden behind it. The second trial. The journal was damning. Page after page of detailed notes, names, dates, methods. Merriweather describing in his own handwriting how he'd identified vulnerable boys, built their trust, manipulated them into compliance, maintained their silence through psychological control. He documented everything like a military operation: target selection, operational planning, execution, after-action analysis. Leland felt sick reading it. But he also felt vindicated. This was the proof they needed. The police arrested Merriweather again in March 1953. This time, there were no protests. This time, even the veterans groups were silent. The journal had leaked to the press. Someone in the DA's office, frustrated by the public support for Merriweather, had provided excerpts to the Inquirer. The headline read, "Hero's Secret Journal Reveals Calculated Predation." The article included direct quotes from the journal, Merriweather's own words, describing his crimes in cold, tactical language. Public opinion shifted overnight. The veterans who defended him felt betrayed, used. The mothers who trusted him felt horrified. Mrs. Fenimore, his staunchest defender, gave an interview where she wept and said she felt like a fool. The second trial was scheduled for July 1953. Pendergast tried to argue that the journal was misinterpreted, that Merriweather had been documenting his attempts to understand why he was being falsely accused, that he'd used military terminology because that was how he thought about problems. But no one was buying it. The entries were too specific, too detailed, too clearly describing real events. The trial lasted a week. The prosecution called the same 7 boys who testified again. This time, they could point to specific journal entries that corroborated their testimony. Wesley Dunmore described a trip to the cellar in May 1952. The journal had an entry from that exact date, describing quote, _179 __. Marcus Carmody described something that happened in July 1952. The journal documented it, using veiled language but clear meaning. One by one, the children's testimony was validated by Merriweather's own written words. Merriweather took the stand again, tried to maintain his innocence. But Leland destroyed him on cross-examination. Quote, 180 quote, 181 quote, 182 quote, 183 quote, 184 quote, 185 quote, 186 quote, 187 quote, quote 188, quote 189, quote 190. Merriweather had no answer. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Judge Harriman sentenced Walter Merriweather to 25 years in state prison. As the bailiff led him away, Merriweather looked back at Leland one last time. His face was pale, defeated. Leland said nothing. There was nothing to say. Aftermath and legacy. Walter Merriweather served 2 years at the State Correctional Institution at Graterford before another inmate attacked him in the exercise yard. The inmate, serving time for armed robbery, was a father of 2. He'd heard about Merriweather's crimes. The attack left Merriweather with permanent injuries, broken ribs, a ruptured spleen, traumatic brain injury. Merriweather spent the rest of his sentence in the prison infirmary, barely functional. He died in May 1962 at age 44 of complications from his injuries. The Bronze Star was returned to his personal effects, later donated to a military museum where it sits in a display case with no mention of its owner's crimes. The 7 boys grew up carrying the weight of what happened to them. Wesley Dunmore struggled with trust and intimacy his whole life. He married 3 times, each marriage ending in divorce. He worked as a machinist like his father had, died of a heart attack in 2005 at age 62. Marcus Carmody became a social worker, dedicating his career to helping abused children. He never married, channeled all his energy into his work. He founded a nonprofit organization in the 1980s that provided therapy and legal support for abuse victims. He died in 2010 at age 68. Ned Stillwater became a teacher, always watching for signs of troubled students, always making sure they knew they could talk to him. He had a family, 2 daughters, tried to give them the childhood he never had. He died in 2015 at age 75. The others led various lives, carrying their scars in different ways. Some found peace, others never did. Leland Harker continued as deputy DA until his retirement in 1970. The Merriweather case defined his career, both the mistrial that almost destroyed him and the conviction that vindicated him. He never forgot the lesson, that heroism in one moment doesn't guarantee virtue in another, that medals are symbols, not character guarantees, that the most dangerous predators are often the most trusted. He died in 2001 at age 95. His grandson, Leland Harker III, followed him into law, became a prosecutor specializing in crimes against children. In 1995, similar allegations emerged against a high school swimming coach in suburban Philadelphia. The coach was beloved, had led his team to multiple state championships, received awards from the school board. Wesley Dunmore's daughter Jennifer was on that swim team. The coach had asked her to stay late after practice, said it was their special secret. But Jennifer remembered what her father had told her when she was young. If any adult asks you to keep a secret that makes you uncomfortable, tell me immediately. No matter who they are, I'll believe you. Jennifer told her father. Wesley, despite his own damage, despite decades of carrying the weight of what Merriweather had done to him, found the strength to act. He called the police that night. The investigation revealed 3 other victims. The coach was arrested, tried, convicted, sentenced to 30 years. Wesley died 2 months later. The stress of reliving his own trauma, of testifying at the coach's trial, triggered the heart attack that killed him. But his daughter stood at his funeral knowing he'd saved her, that because someone had once believed him, he'd known to believe her. The Merriweather case changed how Philadelphia handled such allegations. Police developed better interview protocols for child witnesses. Prosecutors took children's testimony more seriously. Social workers received training in recognizing grooming behaviors. It wasn't perfect. Nowhere close. Children were still sometimes disbelieved. Cases still fell apart. Predators still escaped justice. But there was progress. Incremental, frustrating, but real. By 2019, when Leland Harker III was teaching at Temple Law School, the world had changed significantly. Mandatory reporting laws, background checks, public awareness of how predators operated. The Merriweather case was studied in law school courses as an early example of prosecuting a trusted community figure for crimes against children. Leland III told his students. He showed them the Merriweather case file, the children's testimony, the journal entries, the community's initial disbelief and eventual acceptance. A student raised her hand. Another student spoke up. The discussion continued for another hour. Leland III answered questions, shared insights from his own cases, emphasized the importance of believing victims while also thoroughly investigating claims. After class, a student approached him privately. Leland III handed her a card with the contact information for the Philadelphia Child Advocacy Center. The student took the card, nodded, left. Leland III sat alone in the empty classroom, thinking about the chain of consequences that stretched from 1952 to now. Wesley Dunmore, terrified but telling the truth. His great-grandfather, believing and acting despite the cost. The conviction that had set precedent. The children saved in subsequent years because that precedent existed. And now this student, who might prevent another child from being victimized because she'd learned from cases like Merriweather's. Progress was slow. Predators still existed, still hid in positions of trust, still exploited vulnerable victims. But there was progress. More awareness, better protocols, greater willingness to investigate and prosecute. The fight continued. The final word. The Grayson apartments were demolished in 1985, replaced by a strip mall with a parking lot where the courtyard once stood. The cellar where Merriweather had committed his crimes was filled with concrete and paved over. The building superintendent who'd praised him, the neighbors who'd defended him, Mrs. Fenimore who'd baked him pies, all were long dead. But the case lived on. In legal textbooks, in training manuals, in the institutional memory of Philadelphia's justice system. In 2010, a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer wrote a retrospective article. __quote _202 __. The article interviewed the surviving victims, now elderly men carrying decades of trauma. It reviewed the case file, the trial transcripts, the journal entries that had sealed Merriweather's conviction. The reporter asked Marcus Carmody, then 68 and dying of cancer, what he wanted people to know. That medals don't make you good, Marcus said, his voice hoarse. That trusting someone because of their past accomplishments is dangerous. That when children tell you something is wrong, you need to listen, really listen. Not dismiss them because the accused is someone important or respected. Listen to the children first. Do you think the justice system handled your case properly? Eventually, but it took too long. We reported what happened in October 1952. The first trial was in February 1953. It ended in a mistrial. If the journal hadn't been found, Merriweather would have walked free. Think about that. 7 children testified, told identical stories, and it wasn't enough. We needed his own written confession before people would believe us. That's not justice. That's children having to prove themselves against impossible standards, while adults get every benefit of the doubt. What would you change? Train people to recognize grooming behaviors. Teach children that they can say no to adults, that their bodies belong to them, that secrets about uncomfortable things should be told immediately. And teach adults to believe children, to investigate thoroughly, to not let respect for someone's achievements blind them to their crimes. Marcus died 3 months after that interview. His nonprofit organization continued his work, helping hundreds of children find justice and healing. Wesley Dunmore's daughter Jennifer became an advocate too. She spoke at schools, taught children about body safety, about trusting their instincts, about telling trusted adults when something felt wrong. Quote, 209, quote, she said at one presentation. Quote, 210, quote, the Merriweather case became a touchstone. When new cases emerged, and they always did, prosecutors, police, and child advocates looked back to 1952 and remembered what Leland Harker had risked to pursue justice. They remembered that doing the right thing often meant facing public opposition, that protecting children sometimes required standing against popular opinion, that medals and awards and community respect didn't grant immunity from accountability. In the archives of the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, the Merriweather case file sits in a special section marked __, quote _211__. It's pulled out regularly for training purposes, studied by new prosecutors learning how to handle difficult cases involving respected defendants. The file includes the children's testimony, the journal entries, photos of Merriweather in his uniform, bronze star gleaming, letters from veterans groups both defending and condemning him, newspaper clippings chronicling the shift in public opinion, and a handwritten note from Leland Harker, added years later. This case taught me that justice requires courage. Courage to believe the vulnerable when society wants to protect the powerful. Courage to pursue truth even when it's uncomfortable, unpopular, and professionally dangerous. Courage to stand firm when everyone is telling you to back down. 7 children found the courage to speak their truth. I hope I found the courage to honor that truth with action. That's all any of us can do. Find courage when it matters most. The note is dated 1985, written when Leland was 79 years old, looking back on his career. He died 16 years later, but his words remain, a reminder to every prosecutor who follows. Justice requires courage. Believe the children. Stand firm. Those lessons, learned in 1952 in a Philadelphia courtroom, echo forward through the decades. They guide investigations, shape prosecutions, protect children who might otherwise remain unheard. The work continues. It always will. Because predators will always exist, always seek positions of trust, always try to use respectability as a shield. But the Merriweather case proved that shields can be broken, that truth can overcome reputation, that children's voices matter, even when arrayed against medals and military glory. Walter Eugene Merriweather earned his Bronze Star. That fact was never disputed. He saved 17 men under fire. That heroism was real. But he also systematically harmed 7 children over several years, using his hero status as both weapon and shield. Both truths existed, and the second truth demanded justice, regardless of the first. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. That's what endures when everything else, the building, the courtyard, the people, has turned to dust. Truth matters more than myths. Children matter more than medals. Justice matters more than reputation. Always.